It was the winter of 1642. England trembled in the shadow of civil war. Outside the manor house of Woolsthorpe, the wind howled across the bleak Lincolnshire countryside. Inside, on a cold Christmas morning, a fragile child drew his first breath. So small, so premature, that no one thought he would live through the night. That child was Isaac Newton. The midwife later recalled that he could have fit into a quart mug. His mother, Hannah Askow, prayed over him, believing every passing hour might be his last. Yet somehow, against all odds, he survived, as if fate had already chosen him for something extraordinary. Isaac was named after his father, Isaac Newton Sr., a wealthy yeoman farmer who had died only months before his son's birth. His death left behind an estate, livestock, and a sense of absence that would haunt Newton's early years. His mother remarried the Reverend Barnabas Smith, a man of position and wealth, but also a man who would take Hannah away from her only child. When she moved to live with her new husband 3 miles away, she left little Isaac behind with his grandparents, and a wound that would never fully heal. Years later, Newton would confess in a private notebook a childhood fantasy: to burn down his stepfather's house with him and his mother inside. That darkness, that sense of abandonment, became a seed that grew inside him, transforming into an obsession with control, precision, and knowledge. It was as if the boy who had once been powerless sought to master the very laws of the universe themselves. The world around him was changing too. Europe was awakening from centuries of medieval thought. The Renaissance had given birth not only to art and beauty, but to inquiry, to doubt. A new breed of thinkers began to ask questions the Church had forbidden for centuries. What if the earth wasn't the center of creation? What if the heavens moved according to natural laws, not divine whim? A century earlier, Nicolaus Copernicus had dared to publish On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, claiming that the Earth revolved around the Sun. His heresy had cracked open the door to modern science. Then came Kepler in Germany, Galileo in Italy, Descartes in France, each pushing that door wider, building a bridge between philosophy and physics. England, however, lagged behind. It was a land torn between monarchy and revolution, between the old and the new. But beneath the political turmoil, a quiet, intellectual storm was forming. Men like Francis Bacon had begun preaching a new way of thinking, the scientific method, the belief that truth could be discovered through observation, experiment, and reason. It was this world, restless and rebellious, into which young Isaac Newton was born. His childhood was lonely. His grandfather's will left him nothing, a cruel symbol of disfavor. Even his relatives seemed to sense he was different, quiet, aloof, forever lost in thought. He built miniature windmills powered by mice, crafted water clocks, and scribbled designs for strange contraptions that no one understood. His teachers at the Grantham Grammar School saw in him a spark, not of brilliance yet, but of relentless curiosity. He wasn't the best student at first, but when provoked by a class rival, he vowed to surpass him in every subject. He did, and then never stopped climbing. Isaac's tutor, Mr. Stokes, encouraged his interest in mathematics and Latin, and for a time, Newton lodged with a local apothecary, Mr. Clark, where he fell into what might have been his first and only romance, a fleeting affection for Clark's stepdaughter. But soon he was called back home to manage the family farm. It was a disaster. The young man spent his days drawing figures in the dirt instead of tending livestock. His mother, frustrated, finally relented and sent him back to school. From that moment, the plow would never again define him. Only the pen, the prism, and the equation. In 1661, Isaac Newton entered Cambridge University, the heart of England's academic life. But Cambridge was still bound to the past. Students memorized Aristotle and recited Latin texts, while Europe was already racing ahead into a new scientific age. Newton, poor but driven, worked as a subsar, cleaning rooms and serving wealthier students to pay his way. Yet isolation became his gift. Away from the chatter of social life, he buried himself in books, not the assigned ones, but the dangerous, revolutionary works of Galileo, Hobbes, and Robert Boyle. In secret, he began filling notebooks with questions and formulas that defied the academic order. He was asking not what the world was, but why it worked. By 1665, his world and all of England was about to change. The Great Plague swept through the cities, leaving death in every alley and silence in every church. The universities closed. Students fled for their lives. Newton returned to Woolsthorpe, the house of his birth, now his refuge and laboratory. And there, in isolation, a young man barely 23 years old began the work that would transform humanity forever. They would later call it his Annus Mirabilis, his miracle year. The year was 1665. England trembled under the shadow of death. The plague had returned, swift, merciless, and unseen. The streets of London fell silent. Bells tolled endlessly for the dead. Even in Cambridge, far from the capital, fear crept through the college halls like a ghost. One by one, the classrooms emptied. The professors fled. The doors of Trinity College slammed shut. And somewhere among the exodus of terrified students rode a 23-year-old Isaac Newton, heading north to his family's estate in Woolsthorpe. There, in the quiet countryside, as the world outside decayed, Newton's mind ignited. He had no laboratory, no professors, no colleagues, just a small room, a few lenses, a prism, a stack of notebooks, and his own restless imagination. For most men, exile meant survival. For Newton, it became revelation. Each morning he worked in silence. The fields around Woolsthorpe shimmered in the summer heat, but inside, the young scholar was building a universe, one calculation at a time. He began with mathematics, scribbling endless rows of equations that seemed to stretch beyond the page. While the world feared the wrath of God, Newton was decoding the logic of creation itself. In the cramped margins of his notes, he expanded the binomial theorem, a mathematical formula that allowed him to unlock patterns no one had seen before. From that seed would grow calculus, the mathematical key to motion, change, and infinity. Though Newton himself didn't call it that yet. He simply knew he was standing on the edge of something vast. To resolve problems by motion, he wrote in Latin at the top of one paper, and then quietly tucked it away in a drawer. The world would not see it for decades. Mathematics led him naturally to mechanics, and mechanics to the deeper mystery of force, why things move and why they stop. He built upon the studies of Galileo and Descartes, but where they had speculated, Newton sought to prove. He rolled objects down inclines, dropped stones, timed pendulums, and noted patterns that no one had charted before. And one afternoon, perhaps while sipping tea in his garden, perhaps staring out of a window, he saw it. An apple fell. It was a simple thing, an event so ordinary it could pass unnoticed 1,000 times a day. But to Newton, it was the whisper of a universal truth. Why should the apple fall straight to the earth and not drift sideways or upward? Was the earth itself pulling it down? And if so, might that same invisible force reach all the way to the moon, holding it in orbit as surely as it held the apple to the ground? He didn't know it yet, but in that question lay the law of universal gravitation, the idea that every object in existence pulls on every other with a force proportional to their masses and the distance between them. It was a concept that united the heavens and the earth, showing that the same force governing a falling apple also guided the planets around the sun. It would take him nearly 20 years to refine it, to prove it, and to dare to publish it. But the seed was planted there, in the silence of plague and solitude. Newton's curiosity didn't stop at motion. He turned his gaze toward light itself, the essence of sight, the bridge between matter and perception. In a small, dark room, he pierced a single hole through the shutter and let a narrow beam of sunlight cut through the air like a blade. With a glass prism, he split the beam, refracting it onto the wall. What appeared was a cascade of colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. A rainbow born from a single ray. Light, he realized, was not pure. It was composed of many colors, each bending differently through the prism. He called them corpuscles, tiny particles of light. With this discovery, he shattered centuries of Aristotelian belief that light was uniform and divine. He took his experiments further, painting threads red and blue, studying how each behaved through glass. He saw that color itself was a property of light, not of the objects that reflected it. To test this, he even stared at the sun through a mirror, burning spots into his eyes, blinding himself temporarily in pursuit of truth. It was reckless, but it was pure Newton, fearless, obsessed, unrelenting. He would later build a telescope that used mirrors instead of lenses, solving the problem of light distortion, a design still used in astronomy today. Meanwhile, the world outside his sanctuary descended into chaos. The Great Fire of London had followed the plague, turning the capital into an inferno. Thousands were left homeless, their faith shaken. While England rebuilt from ashes, Newton's mind burned brighter than ever. He began to see the world as a vast mathematical machine, predictable, ordered, precise. Every motion, every collision, every orbit could be described in terms of laws. Laws that he, a reclusive young man in rural Lincolnshire, was discovering with nothing but thought and ink. By the time 1666 ended, he had drafted the foundations of modern physics, calculus, and optics. He was 24 years old. No one yet knew what he had done. The papers sat locked away in his chest, unshared, uncelebrated, waiting for the right moment to change the world. In later years, Newton would call this period his annus mirabilis, his miracle years. But for now, he simply returned to Cambridge when the plague had passed, quietly resumed his place among his peers, and said nothing of the universe he had just rewritten. The plague had finally loosened its grip on England. By the spring of 1667, the air once again filled with the sounds of life. Carts creaking over cobblestones, the chatter of students returning to their colleges. Among them was Isaac Newton, now 25 years old, quietly making his way back to Cambridge with a satchel full of notebooks that contained the blueprints of a new universe. He told no one what he had done. There were no declarations, no grand presentations. Newton wasn't a man of spectacle. He was, at heart, a watcher, the kind of mind that preferred silence to applause. But slowly, word began to spread. A few trusted colleagues glimpsed fragments of his notes, pages filled with complex symbols and meticulous calculations. Most didn't understand them. Those who did were stunned. Within a year, Newton was appointed Fellow of Trinity College, and soon after, in 1669, he earned the prestigious title of Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, one of the most respected academic chairs in the world. He was only 26. The position required him to lecture once a week during term, a trivial duty for a man whose thoughts lived far beyond the walls of a classroom. Most of his students couldn't follow his logic anyway. He spoke softly, almost reluctantly, filling the board with equations so advanced they bordered on incomprehensible. On some days, no one even showed up, and he would lecture to an empty room. But solitude was his natural state. In those empty halls, Newton refined the discoveries he had made during his isolation in Woolsthorpe. He built instruments to demonstrate his theories, prisms, lenses, and a small reflecting telescope that used mirrors instead of refractive glass. When he sent it to London in 1671, it caused a quiet sensation. The Royal Society, England's newly founded scientific body, immediately wanted to know more. And so, in January 1672, Isaac Newton, the boy once abandoned by his mother, the recluse who had spent years in silence, was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it marked the beginning of conflict. Within months, Newton submitted his first major paper, a treatise on light and color. In it, he dismantled centuries of belief, showing that light wasn't pure or divine, but composed of multiple colors, each bending differently through a prism. It was revolutionary and deeply unsettling to many. Among those unsettled was Robert Hooke, one of the Royal Society's most influential members. Hooke was brilliant, ambitious, and notoriously jealous. He had studied optics himself, and Newton's bold assertions threatened to eclipse his own work. What began as academic disagreement soon turned personal. Hooke accused Newton of errors, misinterpretations, even theft. The society became a battlefield, Newton's crystalline logic clashing against Hooke's acerbic wit. Letters flew back and forth, polite at first, then venomous. Newton, hypersensitive and proud, took it all as betrayal. He withdrew from London, severed contact, and for a time even considered abandoning science altogether. "I am done with philosophy," he wrote bitterly. "I am weary of the world." Yet genius, once awakened, cannot easily rest. Back in Cambridge, Newton turned inward again. His mind, restless as ever, began to drift beyond the material world. He immersed himself in alchemy, that ancient blend of chemistry, mysticism, and superstition. Late at night, candlelight flickered over shelves lined with bottles, powders, and handwritten manuscripts filled with cryptic symbols. Newton wasn't searching for gold, he was searching for truth, believing that hidden within alchemy lay the original wisdom of the ancients, the code by which God had designed creation itself. His notebooks from this period are dense with secret formulas and sketches of furnaces. He called one of his treatises The Vegetation of Metals. To modernize, it seems like folly. But in Newton's world, alchemy was not a fantasy. It was the precursor to chemistry, a path toward understanding the invisible structures of matter. And so, while England's scholars debated optics and orbits, Newton pursued another kind of light, the divine spark hidden within all things. But he was also human, and the solitude that had once been his strength began to corrode him. He avoided conversation, ignored invitations, and kept his personal life shrouded in mystery. He never married, never courted, never seemed drawn to anyone at all. Some speculated he was celibate by choice, others whispered he was incapable of affection. In truth, Newton belonged to no one, and perhaps to nothing. His devotion was absolute, but it was given to knowledge, not to love. By the late 1670s, he had written a series of papers on motion and mechanics that hinted at his growing obsession, gravity. Still, he refused to publish them widely. Fear of criticism, of misinterpretation, of humiliation, it haunted him. The wounds left by Robert Hooke had not healed. The irony was cruel. Newton, whose mind had revealed the laws of the cosmos, could not master the laws of his own pride. In the coming years, that pride would be tested again, and this time on a scale that would define his legacy forever. Across Europe, whispers of a new mathematical discovery were spreading. A German philosopher named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz had developed a new system for describing change, a system strikingly similar to Newton's own hidden work in calculus. 2 men, 2 minds, 1 discovery. The stage was set for one of the greatest intellectual rivalries in history, a battle not of swords, but of symbols, egos, and the ownership of truth itself. By the early 1680s, Isaac Newton was no longer a young man lost in thought. He was a figure of quiet power. His reputation had grown across England, whispered about in the halls of Cambridge and the chambers of the Royal Society. His telescope had changed astronomy. His studies on light had reshaped optics. Yet the world still didn't know the full scope of his genius, because Newton hadn't told them. For nearly 20 years, the discoveries he made during his miracle years lay buried in his notebooks, guarded like sacred relics. He shared them with no one, afraid of criticism, jealous of his secrets, and haunted by the biting feud with Robert Hooke. But fate and friendship would soon draw him out of the shadows. In 1684, a man named Edmund Halley rode from London to Cambridge. Halley was an astronomer, brilliant and fearless, the kind of mind Newton might have tolerated, or even admired. He had a question that troubled every scientist of the age. Why do the planets move the way they do? Kepler had charted their paths a century before, but no one had explained why they followed those elegant curves through the heavens. Hooke and others had tried to find the mathematical law behind it, but failed. When Halley posed the question, Newton didn't hesitate. "I have it," he said simply. "I have calculated it already." Halley, stunned, asked to see the proof. Newton disappeared into his study, and weeks later sent Halley a paper, a short but dazzling work that described the precise mathematical law of gravity governing the planets. The force that pulled an apple to the ground was the same force that bound the moon to the earth and the earth to the sun. The cosmos, Newton revealed, was not chaos. It was clockwork. Halley immediately grasped the significance. He urged Newton to expand his findings into a book, a monumental work that would unite all of physics under a single system of laws. For months, Halley coaxed, pleaded, and finally offered to finance the printing himself. Newton, driven by curiosity and perhaps a growing sense of destiny, agreed. And so began the creation of Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. For nearly 3 years, Newton locked himself away again, writing feverishly. The world outside was unraveling. King James II, a Catholic monarch in a Protestant nation, had ignited rebellion. Armies gathered, conspiracies flared, and England teetered on the edge of civil war once more. But inside his study at Cambridge, Newton's war was not with kings. It was with the universe itself. He rewrote everything, every equation, every argument, until perfection. The manuscript grew to hundreds of pages, dense with geometry and symbols. He refused rest. Friends worried for his health. He ate little, slept less. His handwriting shrank to a crawl, as though he were racing against time itself. Finally, in 1687, Principia Mathematica was published. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The book was divided into 3 sections. The first explained the laws of motion, 3 simple rules that could describe everything from a falling stone to the orbit of a planet. 1. Every object remains in motion or at rest unless acted upon by an external force. 2. The change of motion is proportional to the force applied. 3. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. With those words, Newton defined the universe. In the second and third sections, he went further, describing the pull of gravity and how it shaped the solar system, how it governed the tides, controlled the moon, and held the stars in their eternal dance. He even corrected the errors of Descartes and expanded on the work of Kepler and Galileo, weaving their discoveries into one unified vision. For the first time in history, humanity understood that the heavens and the earth were ruled by the same invisible laws. It was nothing less than the language of God, written in mathematics. But even as the world celebrated, Newton's old insecurities stirred. He knew that others, especially Leibniz in Germany, were working along similar lines. Both men had developed calculus, the mathematics of motion and change, seemingly at the same time. At first, the coincidence seemed harmless, but soon whispers turned to accusations. Who had discovered it first? Who deserved the glory? Newton, fiercely protective, insisted the idea had been his all along, born during his plague years. He combed through old letters, editing dates, gathering witnesses. Leibniz, dignified but proud, defended himself with equal force. What began as an academic dispute grew into an international scandal, one that would divide England and the continent for generations. The Newton-Leibniz feud was a war of intellect and ego, fought with pamphlets, letters, and reputation. Newton's allies at the Royal Society, of which he was now the most influential member, rallied behind him, while Leibniz found support in Germany. Each accused the other of plagiarism. Each claimed to be the rightful father of calculus. The irony was cruel. Both were right. In truth, they had discovered the same truth independently, a testament to how ideas, like gravity itself, pull minds together across time and space. Meanwhile, England itself was changing. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution toppled King James II, replacing him with William and Mary. Power shifted from monarchy to parliament. Newton, who had long avoided politics, was drawn in almost accidentally. When the University of Cambridge was forced to send representatives to Parliament, Newton agreed, reluctantly, to stand for election. He won. In Westminster, he sat quietly, listening to debates about power, faith, and freedom. The story goes that his only recorded words in Parliament were a polite request to close a window because of a draft. Newton had conquered nature, but human affairs bored him. Still, his brief foray into politics widened his circle. He met John Locke, the philosopher of knowledge and reason, and others, who saw in him not just a mathematician, but a mind shaped for governance. That connection would soon lead him to a role he never expected, and one that would reveal a very different side of the man who discovered the laws of the universe. London, 1696. The city was reborn, rebuilt from fire and plague into a world of trade, coffeehouses, and restless ambition. In this new age, few men commanded as much quiet respect as Sir Isaac Newton. But behind the scholar's calm eyes, a storm was still brewing. After decades at Cambridge, Newton left the cloistered halls of academia and entered the bustling heart of empire. He had been appointed warden of the Royal Mint, and soon after, master of the Mint, a position that placed him at the center of England's economy. It was an unlikely role for a physicist, but Newton treated it as he did everything else, with absolute rigor and an almost frightening sense of order. At the time, England's coins were being clipped, thin slivers of silver shaved from the edges by counterfeiters and smugglers. The nation's currency was collapsing. Newton responded not as a bureaucrat, but as a scientist and a hunter. He personally led investigations into the criminal underworld of London, disguising himself, interrogating suspects, and compiling meticulous evidence. His methods were ruthless, his logic unbreakable. Within 2 years, the great recoinage was complete. Millions of new coins minted, the old silver melted down, the economy stabilized. The achievement transformed him from a scholar into a statesman, the man who could bring order not only to the cosmos, but to chaos itself. But the order came at a cost. Power had sharpened Newton's edges. He had grown stern, secretive, and increasingly paranoid. The old rivalries that had once haunted him, with Hooke, with Leibniz, still burned in the background. When Robert Hooke died in 1703, Newton became president of the Royal Society and, some said, ensured that every portrait of his rival was quietly destroyed. Whether true or not, it fit the legend that Newton, the man who explained gravity, could not forgive those who pulled at his pride. Under his leadership, the Royal Society flourished. He reformed its finances, expanded its membership, and made it the beating heart of British science. Yet he also ruled it like an empire. Dissent was unwelcome. Rival ideas, especially those that challenged his own, were crushed with icy precision. In 1705, Queen Anne knighted him, Sir Isaac Newton, the first scientist in Europe to receive such an honor. The boy once left behind by his mother now stood at the summit of power, revered as England's living embodiment of reason and intellect. But even as the world bowed before him, Newton drifted ever deeper into isolation. By now, in his 60s, he returned to his first great fascination, light. In 1704, he published Optics, a masterpiece that expanded upon the work he had begun 4 decades earlier with his prism in Woolsthorpe. It was more than a book of science, it was a book of philosophy. Newton proposed that light was composed of particles, corpuscles, and that color, reflection, and refraction all followed measurable, universal laws. It was also the first major scientific text published in English rather than Latin, signaling a shift from the old world of scholars to the new world of thinkers and experimenters. Once again, Newton was reshaping not only science, but the way the world thought about knowledge itself. Yet beneath the brilliance, his mind had begun to darken. He became obsessed with alchemy, the mystical forerunner of chemistry, and spent countless nights surrounded by retorts, crucibles, and thick, acrid fumes. His manuscripts from this period, written in code, filled with symbols and riddles, reveal a man searching not for gold, but for divine truth. He believed the ancients had known the secret to matter, to transmutation, to the spiritual architecture of the universe, and he meant to rediscover it. To some, this was madness. To Newton, it was revelation. The same force that held the stars in their courses, he believed, must also bind the soul to creation. He wrote of prophecy, biblical chronology, and even the end of the world, which he, calmly, mathematically, might occur around 2060. He did not claim to predict apocalypse, but to reveal the divine order hidden in Scripture. His God was not a distant being of miracles, but the great architect of natural law, the mathematician of eternity. In public, he was composed, almost regal. In private, he grew suspicious, irritable, and prone to long silences. Former friends avoided him. Servants whispered that he would stay up all night, pacing the floor, muttering calculations under his breath. He argued with colleagues, feuded with the astronomer John Flamsteed, and tried to seize his research to claim credit for discoveries of his own. Even his brilliant mind, it seemed, could not escape human weakness. Still, his intellect never dimmed completely. He oversaw new editions of the Principia in 1713 and 1726, refining and correcting his theories. He worked with Halley on the orbits of comets, helped the Royal Navy explore new ways to measure longitude, and inspired a generation of scientists who would carry his methods into the modern age. By the 1720s, age had begun to slow him. He suffered from kidney stones and agonizing gout, but he continued to attend meetings of the Royal Society, always impeccably dressed, his white wig immaculate, his expression unreadable. To the end, he demanded precision, in thought, in language, in the universe itself. On March 20, 1727, after one final meeting of the Society, Newton fell ill and never recovered. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 84. England buried him with honor in Westminster Abbey, beside kings and poets, a scientist laid to rest as a monarch of the mind. 3 centuries later, his shadow still stretches across the world. Every rocket that breaks Earth's gravity, every telescope that peers into the cosmos, every equation that predicts the dance of stars, all trace their lineage back to the mind of Isaac Newton. Yet perhaps his greatest lesson was not about motion or force or light. It was about the human search for order in a chaotic world. The need to understand, to name, to find meaning in the infinite. Newton was not just a scientist, he was the first to prove that reason itself could be divine. His laws may one day be replaced, as Einstein's were, as ours will be. But the act of seeking, that eternal curiosity, remains the true inheritance of Newton's mind. Because long before he defined gravity, Isaac Newton had already discovered the weight of wonder.